Welcome to this iMOVE webinar on the future transport and mobility environment. My name's Ian Christensen. I'm the Managing Director of iMOVE, and I'm your host for today. While the COVID crisis swirls around us, for this seminar, I ask you to take a step back and consider the transport system in your city and your country as a whole. Our population is growing, and COVID notwithstanding, the demand for movement grows with it. Our technology is also advancing, especially our digital technology. And this now enables the transport task to be viewed from the bottom up, as well as the historical top-down approach. By this, I mean, it's now possible to consider the combined travel needs of all individual travellers, as well as the operational challenges of managing traffic and operating various modes of public transport. We're now able to see transport as a single complex system in place of the siloed mode-based view of the past. But as I'm sure many of you know, coming to grips with that complex system is difficult. Today, to guide us through this perspective, we're joined by three speakers, Charles Karl, Ishra Baksh, and Susan Harris, who will address the transport system from three perspectives. They will give us their thoughts first, and then I'll invite you to join the discussion by submitting your questions. But first, to some housekeeping. Audience cameras and microphones will be automatically turned off, as will the chat function. I invite you to contribute your questions at any time using the Q&A channel that can be accessed via the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. The presentations will run for about 20 minutes, and that will be followed by half an hour of questions and answers and panel discussion. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the iMOVE website, hopefully tomorrow. So to business. Our first speaker today is Dr. Charles Karl. Charles has over 35 years experience in ITS. He's currently the National Discipline Leader for Transport Systems at ARRB. His experience covers many areas, including traffic management, network performance, telematics, big data, and connected and automated vehicles. Charles is a member of the Australian delegation to the International Standards Organisation on ITS standardisation, and he chairs the scientific research group of the Australian-New Zealand Driverless Vehicle Initiative. Charles is going to share with us his perspective on the future transport and mobility environment. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Ian. Just get the screen up and running. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge with deep appreciation the support of TMR, iMOVE, and ARRB to undertake this project. Transport has changed so much in the last 10 or 20 years. When I look back, we started tolling in Melbourne in 1999, 2000, about 20 years ago. And it was only about 10 years ago when we started to see the smartphone and then the iPad. The iPad came out 2010, I remember being in Silicon Valley. And since that time, transport has really changed, especially for us as practitioners. Talking about trying to make sense of transport let me just get to the next one. Making sense of transport. It's quite strange that as a practitioner, I talk about making sense of transport. Why is that important? Making sense is so important because for businesses, for governments, and even for ourselves as travelers, the more we understand, then we can coordinate better. We can have regulations, we can have operational frameworks better. And for businesses, it offers opportunities for investments. It offers productivity. The transport and mobility environment has changed a lot. And this project was trying to come up with a new concept, trying to look at the forest again. Is the forest the same? Has the forest changed? And it supports a lot of foundational work in preparation of activities, coordination, investments, and future solutions. In fact, when I started looking, and I mentioned earlier about mobile phones, the same sort of upheaval happened in telecommunications more than 10 years ago, where from the fixed phone lines, we started to see the smartphone emerge. And when the Australian regulators started to look at the environment, then they looked at the digital pipeline and they say, if you look at the top hand of right-hand side of that figure, you see the content layer. And in that content layer, there's voice, there's video, there's data, there's Netflix, and all those sorts of things. And those other layers, the infrastructure, the transport layer, and the applications and services provide the foundational base in order to deliver really the content that we are now so comfortable using. And so when I try to transpose that to transport, then I started off with looking at our physical environment today. And here are the silos in public, in private transport, in commercial transport. And alongside that, I used the same concept and looked at it in terms of layers, like the telecommunication side. So the top layer being the journeys that we make, whether it's for private purposes or our freight journeys or our public transport journeys or even our journeys to get food and so on in this environment. And all the supporting layers, the infrastructure, the connectivity, and the services layer. So you can see that this concept of looking at our environment has changed from a siloed view to a layered view. Not to say that in those silos, those layers did not exist. They do exist, but the build out of our digital infrastructure has really transformed that layer. And the bigger part of the work that I did was to try to identify the key components in that layer. So once again, if you look at the very top of the picture, you can see the services, whether it's traveling on public transport or freight services or mobility as a service services, and so on. But if you look again at the bottom of the figure, then you can see the foundational layers, the physical layer, the roads, the rail, the clouds, the sensors, the connectivity layers, going up to the data layers, the logical elements, how everything works together, and the processing of it in order to deliver the services. It is important to understand this, what others have called the Australian pantry. Because when you talk about a solution, then you pull together all of these components in your pantry to deliver a solution. So when you look at a PT solution or a mass solution or a charging solution or a journey planner solution, then all of these things start to fall into place. Having said all of that and provided a very high level view of a concept, then let's look at roles and responsibilities and how they are changing in our lifetime. So I wanted to start with something very simple. Look at private transport. Let's say you have a car, you drive on the road. Is that all that happens? Well, firstly, you need to go for driver training and then you get a driver's license. You need to register the car. So there are some regulatory, and then when you drive on the road, there's traffic management. You have to stop at the traffic lights. So this is something that you all understand. And if you look at the arrows, then that denotes the responsibilities, what you have to do, what governments have to do, what traffic managers have to do, and so forth. In fact, for the car, sometimes you might rent a car, or you might use a taxi, or you might finance the car. So you still have obligations to the financier and so on and so forth. Let's look at public transport then. So if you look at public transport, again, the same roles and responsibilities, but in this case, when you take a bus or a train or even a chauffeured limousine to the airport, for example, then you travel on infrastructure And there is this most important thing called a service provider. In fact, we've always had service providers, taxi companies, bus companies, rail companies, and in more recent times, car sharing, car hailing, ride hailing services like Uber, where you can have a whole range of services, not the least being even Uber Eats and Uber Freight and so on. So what does the future transport ecosystem look like? Now, if you look at this figure and the first figure about the car and how you drive the car on the network, nothing much has changed except the definitions that I have used. So starting on the left-hand side, where I talk about vehicles, cars or buses or e-scooters or motorbikes and so forth, there are transport services. When I talk about transport infrastructure like road or rail or parking, there are infrastructure operators. And we are all used to this because we have tolling companies in a few of our jurisdictions. And they operate that infrastructure and we pay a fee when we traverse that infrastructure. Now, if you look at service providers, then I've added a lot more service providers because in the future, in addition to Uber and the likes, we are going to see a lot more service providers like journey planners, like payment services, and so on and so forth. And really, the big growth in mobility has been these service providers who offer more opportunities to integrate all of our transport systems together. So the final slide I have for my presentation is to compare today's environment and the environment in the future. Now, on the left-hand side of the slide, you see something that you are familiar with. This is our infrastructure, our vehicles, the service providers, and at the bottom, you can see the physical infrastructure. As I mentioned before, we are gradually building out our digital infrastructure, which has a whole range of core elements that I've described as the pantry. And on top, I show the roles and responsibilities model. Now, the interesting thing about that, as I've mentioned, when you look at making sense, is to go back to the forest and the trees and to say, who are the transport infrastructure operators? Who are the transport service providers? Who will be the system manager and the regulator? When we look at Australia and our states and our local governments and our national governments, what does a system manager have to do in an integrated mobility environment? What is that role? Do we have those roles there? What are the regulations that are required? What are the operational frameworks that are required? And so on and so forth. So as most of you come from the transport industry or have interests in the transport industry, and every one of you are transport users, then looking at it from your different perspectives, as a user, obviously you interact with regulations, you interact with traffic management, you interact with payment services and so forth. As regulators, as operators of services, the idea then is having this common vision across Australia, across our states, our local councils, our national, and across the world. It makes us easier to cooperate, to understand, and to work with each other. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thanks, Charles. And for the audience, just to let you know that we will make Charles' slides available on the through the iMOVE website, either at the end of the presentation today or tomorrow. So to our next speaker, Ishra Baksh. Ishra is the Executive Director of the Mobility as a Service Program, the Mobility as a Service Program Management Office at the Department of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, where she's responsible for the department's focus on mass and future mobility. With experience in the public service and private sector, Ishra has led a range of strategy and delivery areas within the Department of Transport and Main Roads, often working in partnership with government and industry to improve the customer experience. Her focus is on collaboration and building strong working relationships in complex environments, which is amply demonstrated in her current role at TMR. Ishra is going to help us understand the role that mobility as a service is going to play in that future transport and mobility environment. Over to you, Ishra.
Thank you, Ian. I appreciate the introduction and I'm really pleased to be part of the conversation today. I'm just going to start by drawing on some of Charles' comments about having an appreciation for the future transport and mobility environment. I think that it's now more important than ever, considering the disruption that we are all experiencing at the moment. There's a focus on freight and the supply chain. We're moving people in different ways, and the renewed focus on cleanliness and safety is very evident across many jurisdictions. The way that our customers are looking at life is changing, and it's enabling us to explore different ways of offering services, staying digitally connected, valuing time differently, and focusing on safety and hygiene are all factors in this changing environment. The shift has the potential to accelerate innovation in our industry as customers seek more timely and accurate information, different travel options, and use technology more and more to access different services. It really is about making sense of the forest from the trees. I really like that. I think the scope of what we do and what we're responsible for is huge. And it's important not to forget and understand the bigger picture, because the impact of what we do is great. We connect people to jobs and education and health, which is becoming more and more important in our society today. The Queensland Government's work and the Department of Transport and Main Roads work in mobility as a service recognises the need for that enabling environment that Charles really spoke about, and that encompasses a broader mobility ecosystem. And I guess from a mobility as a service perspective, innovations in broader mobility bring about better conditions for mass to be of value to a customer. So, you know, we can offer a really great digital experience through an application that has that integrated planning, booking and payment, but it's how we work together to make the conditions on the network better for people to have trust in those connected journeys and to want to engage in multimodal journeys. I think at the moment that focus, I guess, on sharing and people wanting to share, for example, in smaller vehicles, that's definitely been impacted around and what's happening with COVID. So I think things like data standards and the partnerships between different service providers, these are the types of conditions that are going to make mobility as a service of value to the customer and will actually enable industry to want to be part of that mass market. Charles spoke about the Australian pantry, and it's important to acknowledge all the work across industry, academia and government that's occurred to actually develop this pantry. A future focus now, I think, is what holds all of those elements together. And I think that's really around partnerships and knowledge sharing and continuous learning, which is what forums like this enable. This can also happen more organically or in a more structured way. And I think that the ability to test and trial elements and how they work together is really important. The roles and responsibilities is also really interesting. I think that government often has different roles in this space. We are obviously a regulator. We see ourselves as the network steward, and there's also an emerging role around data and being a data broker. Different parts of our department play these roles as well. So for government, it's important that we collaborate within. It's not just about public transport or micromobility or registration and licensing. We also need to have that mindset around mobility. The paper really is speaking to the Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads vision around a single integrated transport network that's accessible to everyone. I think that a shift in thinking is required now to ensure things like public transport and mobility services remain relevant into the future. And I guess the work that Charles has done in identifying the elements of the pantry and some of the next steps of what needs to happen is really important. when we talk about mobility, the department's vision and goals don't necessarily change. So for government, we talk about public value and increased partnerships and supporting industry. We really want improved utilization of the network. From a customer perspective, it's about improved transport choices, which are better integrated, improved confidence in information and services, and also working towards that personalization factor that a lot of customers are looking for. And I know for industry, it's that increased partnerships, new market opportunities, and leveraging that learning and knowledge sharing. So we're very pleased that we could be part of this piece of research. And thank you again for allowing me to be part of the conversation. And I'm really interested to hear everybody else's thoughts.
Thanks, Isra. So let's go now to our next speaker, Susan Harris. Susan is the Chief Executive of ITS Australia, and with her extensive career in transport strategy, Susan's ideally placed to guide organisations through the intersection of transport and technology. Supported by strong connections to the international ITS community and the global network of ITS Association, Susan advocates vigorously for the benefits of transport technologies for business and for the broader Australian community. Susan is highly regarded for her role supporting the growth and innovation of the nation's transport technology industries. She works across a number of industry advisory groups and is a regular advisor to state and federal governments and their ministers on transport technology and mobility issues. Susan's going to reflect on the contributions that intelligent transport systems and other emerging technologies are making to the future transport and mobility environment. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks very much to yourself and the iMOVE team for hosting this webinar. I think it's a really important conversation, and I'd like to congratulate ARRB, TMR and iMOVE for undertaking this great work that really looks at the framework to take us forward in what is quite a rapidly changing environment at the moment in emerging transport technology, and pivoting what we've come to something that maybe looks quite different. I was going to take the opportunity today just to reflect from an industry point of view on some of the, I've had the opportunity over the last week to be involved in some really interesting conversations and workshops that I think really highlight why we need strong frameworks and the advantage in having a fresh look at the way we organise ourselves as a transport sector. So last week, ITS Australia hosted a regular community of practice in transport data, and that really brought out the excitement that industry is seeing and our government partners around the opportunity for data, but also some of the complexities to harness that, and also the increased connectivity and sharing of that data across platforms, across different modes between private and public partners. So we've got that sort of complex space happening, and we're just really starting to see and explore how we might leverage that data in different ways to really deliver more solutions back through to the end customer and really enhance their experience. On the other hand, I was involved with some super experienced ITS professionals looking at ITS standards and looking at how we can, the complex situation that we now face in Australia, that we're looking to improve the interoperability and the connectedness as we move into an increasingly connected space, and some of the historical constraints that we now face in terms of moving forward in traditional ITS technologies and how we might bring that forward, and just the importance of standards and how we're all relating in different ways moving forward. And particularly the role of connected vehicles in that space and how that's changing who plays in what space in that connected vehicle space. And then lastly, we had our mass reference group. So we were pleased to have Ishra along to that. So that's the working group that's really looking at that increased connectivity, whether it's mass or new mobility solutions, whether it's shared transport or whether it's more active transport with scooters and booking bikes that you might share. Again, we're seeing an unprecedented level of connectedness and interrelationships between these new integrated modes. So I think with all of those changes, we're seeing an increased complexity across the transport space. We can no longer look at them as individual silos that we can manage quite independently. The modes are much more integrated. We're also seeing an unprecedented level of interaction between government and industry. So again, that we don't have those sort of strong contractual lines so much anymore, but there's much more blurring of boundaries and interaction with people taking on different roles and able to interact in different ways. So with all those changes taking place, I think that need for an overarching framework that helps us to all clearly understand the roles of different players, the roles of other players out there, helps give great clarity to everyone as we look to add value in what's a really quite a changing environment. And I think the more that we can do that, I see there's some questions in the chat around the, what's the commercial role and how does that work? And I think some of that helps by having those frameworks around how the ecosystem is going to operate. We can then start to look at what the commercial models might be, who's got responsibility for what areas, and having that clarity puts us in a great stead. Particularly, I think no more than ever at the moment with the environment we see with COVID, we've had to do some pretty rapid turnarounds of thinking and be really adaptable, and having that clear view as to the interrelationships and the interactions, I think really is a strong support for that. So again, really congratulate the team on the work that's taken place, and I think it puts Australia in a really good position moving forward.
Thanks, Susan. So now we'll shift gears a little and start to address your questions. We've already received quite a few, but if you've not yet submitted a question, now would be a good time to do so. But being the moderator, I get to ask the first one. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists, perhaps starting with Susan, what would you identify as the biggest underlying drivers of change? What's forcing the pace on the transport sector that you see at work and that we should pay close attention to as we evolve the transport system? So Susan first, and perhaps then Isra and Charles.
Thanks, Ian. Look, I think, very much it's technology led, to be honest. I think that we've got increased level of sensing and data and information, increased power to process that, and the speed with which that can happen is empowering that level of connectivity back to the end consumer in a way that, we're seeing everyone's got a computer in their hand that can connect them with a whole world of opportunity in the transport space. And I think we're really grappling to catch up with the systems and processes that can enable us to leverage the power of that technology in many ways. So, so it's that, conversations such as these and the bringing together of the various partners that can really help to accelerate bringing forward some of the benefits from the technology that we're seeing.
Yeah, the technology is pushing forward very strongly. Thanks, Susan. Isra, what do you think are the strongest drivers affecting the change process?
I definitely agree with Susan. It's that technology piece. I think from a mobility as a service perspective, technology is what makes MAS possible. That integrated planning, booking and payment. I think that as we've discussed, the technology is there. It's available to be used. It's quite user-centric, so it's quite intuitive and people like it. They're already using it out there. But I guess when you talk about some challenges, it's the human things that we need to think about. So the partnerships between different providers and the commercial arrangements and the market and all of those things are, I guess, more the complexities.
Thanks, Isra. And Charles, you've been an observer of this for a long time. What's pushing the system into a new environment?
Well, certainly, as Susan and Isra said, it's the technology, but I'd rather express it slightly differently. When the first car came out, I suppose you could have any color, so long as it was black. And cars generated a lot of change in our lives with lean production and so forth. Okay. I think right now, we have so many choices for our journeys. And not only that, because of the current situations that we are in, we can see a life going forward that is not going to be the same as the life that we had before. Okay. And how can the transport and mobility system cope? So we are going to be demanding as users, right, a whole range of different services, personalized, and no one day is going to be the same as as the next day, you see. So there'll be so much more flexibility. And we cannot run the transport system we ran before, where we looked at it as, you know, you take your car to work 5 days a week. Every day is going to be different. So I suppose we have the tools in place. It's more to do with, as one person mentioned, the business models, the regulatory environment, and the operational framework. Because basically, like fiber, we are looking at a pipeline, and that pipeline is our land transport pipeline. And do we really care if it's data or voice or video or Netflix? And how are we going to manage all of that on the pipeline? We've got the curbs, we've got the pavements, we've got the rails, and maybe we've got 500 feet above for our drones to fly as well. That is our pipeline.
Thanks, Charles. So talking about making it happen, I'm going to pick up a couple of questions around sustainability. But I'm going to split it into two groups. I think there's a question about environmental sustainability of our transport system, and there's a question also about the economic sustainability of our transport system. So let's start with the environmental part. Is the transport system that we're building going to be environmentally sustainable? I don't know. Isra, is mobility as a service environmentally sustainable? Is it heading in an environmentally sustainable direction?
I think that it has the potential to be. I think there's, you know, with shared transport and you know, organizations using, I guess, cleaner forms of transport, I think that there's a role for government to, you know, in mobility as a service, we talk about the different policy levers that you can push and pull to get the behaviours that you want. So I think there's a role for government here in potentially, you know, incentivising different things and working with industry. So yes, I think mobility as a service has the potential to encourage more sustainable forms of transport, but there are some policy considerations that government needs to consider in order to move towards that direction.
Sure. Charles?
Yeah, can I answer that question? You know, many of you might have seen pictures of the horse and carriage and how our streets, even our streets in Melbourne or Sydney, was just full of horses and carriages. And all of a sudden, the first few cars started to appear. And I always wonder where they got their petrol from, you see. And then a few years later, you know, all the horse and carriages are gone, and there's cars giving as much congestion as with the horse and carriage. So in terms of sustainability, to follow on Ishra's point, yes, there is at some point we get to a critical point, and we flip. We flip to EVs or zero emission vehicles. But the other point as well is at some point we flip and we say, hey, part of our network now should be filled with bicycles and people walking on some parts of our network, you see. And when is that going to happen? You know, if more of us work from home in our core environments, and if we look at our regional and remote environments, then also those things could change. How are we going to do freight? Would hydrogen vehicles work in that environment? And when will that happen without you know, some stimuli, if you like?
Thanks, Charles. So to the economic or the business sustainability question, Susan, you've dealt with both the industry and the government side of this over years. How do you see the business sustainability of our future transport system evolving? You're on mute too.
Thanks, Ian. I was hoping to avoid that phrase today. I think it's a really interesting question about that economic sustainability, and I think it comes back in part to those policy levers that Ishra was talking about. You know, we're really strong believers that we still need to have efficient and effective transport modes. So that means that ultimately we still need to be striving towards if we are going to continue to live in cities, and believes that, you know, while we may be seeing a move away from that over the current few months, that, you know, we will get back to that. So we still need efficient mass transit ways of moving people around, and we need to have the right policy levers in place that encourage use of efficient transport so that we can have economically efficient solutions overall. And I think that's a really good sort of intro into that broader transport pricing approach. So making sure that we price transport appropriately in consideration, you know, is it sustainable? Is it helping to use the network efficiently? Is it getting people to where they need to be and got the right socio-economic balance as well? So there's a lot of things to be considered. Some of those, you know, private sector are really well set up to deal with. Some of them are levers that government can pull to sort of nudge the private sector into providing services in the right areas. And I think also having that overarching framework helps people to clearly understand the role that they play. So it's not a straightforward space. And I don't think we have to get the answer right straight up, but we need to have the flexibility and the frameworks in place that enable us to twist and turn and to adapt as we need to. But certainly, I think with new and emerging transport modes, there's an opportunity to move towards more efficient solutions that enable us to deliver on-demand solutions where they're needed, to deliver shared solutions more efficiently and effectively, while getting that balance with what, you know, individual customers are looking for here and now.
So Susan, perhaps staying on that question a little bit, given that governments actually contribute the vast majority of the funding to the construction and operation of both public transport and the road network, do we need to evolve the model by which that funding is applied, the services that it's spent on to establish? Is there further evolution that needs to happen in that space, in the allocation of both public and private sector funding into the transport network?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a real opportunity to, you know, we're still anticipating that there'll be a strong government contribution into transport services, that, you know, that's the way, you know, particularly, you know, where we operate in Australia. So to step away from that would be, you know, dramatic change for Australia. But that's still, that government funding is still critically important. But certainly there's an opportunity to rethink how that funding gets allocated, and the opportunity to take it away from fixed transport routes that, you know, perhaps are not servicing the community as well as they could, and direct them more into on-demand services potentially. And I think the challenge here is that there's no, what we're hearing from our new mobility providers is it's not a one solution fits all. We can't say, you know, this is what we need to move to. And it becomes very much a local solution that gets tailored in consultation with the local community. Local government are very close to what their community are looking for and needing. So it's coming up with these efficient models that are able to adapt and fit in with local demand and direct the money to where it needs to be spent, and where it gets best recognised in those local areas.
Thanks, Susan. So I'm going to extend it a little bit further. And so since ISRA's, you know, intently involved in the development of mobility as a service, particularly in Queensland, so ISRA, do you have any comments that you could contribute on the role that you see government playing in the preparation and subsequent delivery of mobility as a service?
Absolutely. So I think the Queensland government's doing quite a bit of work in this space, and I've seen from some of the questions that have come through, they're talking about what is that commercial model and how do you actually make it viable, and how does government actually encourage that industry. There is a part that we play through regulation, making sure that, I guess, the mass operators that operate in the state are providing value to the customer. They're handling things like complaints and you know, customer inquiries and safety in particular. I think safety plays a really big part in it as well. I think that from a mass perspective, and David has asked a question here around multimodal versus multi-service. So mobility as a service is about the place that you're getting to. And often if it's a hospital or if it's a shopping center, it's the non-transport related connection into mobility as a service that could really contribute towards that commercial model. If you think about Woolworths or Coles, you know, combining with their loyalty points and insurance and that type of thing, I think that's where organisations could see a benefit when it comes to mobility as a service. And that Australian pantry slide that Charles had in his presentation speaks to, I guess, a lot of the complexities around how you actually make that work. If you talk about things like incentives and subscriptions, I don't think that government sees themselves playing a role in that. That's very much left to the private sector, because they can make, I guess, the right, you know, relationships and offer the customer the different deals that are of interest and value to the customer. But it's also, from a government perspective, making sure that those things are fair. The other thing, I guess, is that when we talk about subscriptions at the moment, you know, there's a lot of education from home, working from home. People aren't traveling as they used to 5 days a week. So there's, I guess, a lot of learning that we need to do in that space around how some of the things that mobility as a service was going to bring is going to work in this new world.
Thanks, Isra. So I'm probably going to stay with Isra, but I'm going to go to another question that's been raised, and that goes to access and benefits from the emerging transport system for people who are, you know, have transport challenges. Either they have a physical disability or a mental disability. How can you make some comments on how you see the system evolving, and what responsibility do you think the system has to provide equity of access, or, you know, access to the whole community, not just the well-off or the physically mobile community?
Yes, and I think it's a great question. From a TMR perspective, we've always said that mobility as a service shouldn't just be for those who can afford it and that are able to use those different options that a mass operator may provide. So from a Queensland government perspective, we see ourselves playing quite a key role in ensuring that equity of access across those different customer segments. Right next to where we sit in the department is our accessible transport network area, which is led by Kevin Cox, who was the previous Anti-Discrimination Commissioner here in Queensland. And we work very closely with him to help understand how government can play a role in making sure that mass is equitable. I think that mobility as a service has the potential to enable or encourage other industry or transport that weren't usually part of the network to be a part of that network and to offer services. Where government steps in is very much around those policy levers and regulation. We need to make sure, though, that we're flexible, that we're not actually stifling that innovation, and we're actually encouraging it and encouraging participants to be part of that environment. So it is quite challenging, but I think that the paper that Charles has done around that future of mobility really brings out the different elements that you need to make it work. It's just how it's just the glue, I guess, that sticks those elements together in the right way.
Thanks, Isra. So I'm going to change tack a little bit and talk now about, so I think Susan mentioned before the need for the transport systems to be efficient. And to be efficient, I anticipate that means they all need to be able to engage with each other in an interoperable way. And that probably means that we need some standards and some connectivity between different elements of the system. So I'm wondering, Susan, in your discussions around intelligent transport systems with all states and governments, have you got some thoughts about standardization and what things should be maintained at a national basis, and perhaps what should be maintained at a state basis?
Thanks, Ian. Look, we've always been strong advocates for harmonisation of standards, both internationally and within Australia. Standards, you know, we we might not know it, but we, you know, we're able to turn on the television, listen to the radio, and do all the, you know, ride on the road, because we all drive on the left-hand side of the road in Australia. So we all operate under a framework of standards that enables us to get by and get access to great technologies. And the ITS space is no different to that. So, you know, there is a need at times for local customization. So it's really a challenge of getting that balance right, of making sure that where we need to, we can have those local customizations. But I know the industry in Australia is really quite active in the international standards space. We would love to have more people put up their hand to get involved in that. It is sometimes tedious work, but it's really valuable work at a technical level, looking at making sure that if we can get people involved working on international ITS standards about, you know, everything from how our traffic lights operate to the evolution of connected vehicle technologies, to make sure that we feed in the unique requirements around the Australian environment, so that we don't need a unique tweak for the Australian context, but they're actually baked into the international standard. So what we see is that opportunity to continue to harmonise and strive for that, that national and that international harmonised approach brings about great benefits for the Australian industry, essentially. We're a relatively small player in Australia. We love to have access to the best and the latest technologies. So if we've got a harmonised space here, it's much easier for technologies that have developed overseas to be readily deployed here. Charles has got a long background working in standards.
Charles, you've been at the coalface on this discussion of standards and harmonisation of the Australian context with developments overseas. Would you care to add a comment to that?
Yes, sure. I think at the highest level, it's making sense, getting that general understanding. And often with you know, across our states, we are all concerned about the same things, but we describe them differently. And one of the good things about standards, like what Susan is talking about, is that a data standard or technology standard starts off with definitions, you see. So if we can all agree on certain definitions, then that in itself goes a long way, you see. When you look at a network, then you are balancing supply with the demand that presents itself, you see, on that network. And the more we can get standardized information on the demand that is presenting itself and the available supply that we have on our network, the better we can have an integrated network, you see. And this is the big problem. So the demand, meaning I want to go to work, I want to go to the gym, I want to move freight, you know, I want to go to the hospital, as it presents itself in real-time windows. And the supply being, what supply do I have on my road, on my rail track, on my vehicles? So that is the coordinated approach, and the standards leads to that direction.
Thanks, Charles. You mentioned their freight, and I think it would be remiss of us not to actually pick up the freight question quite specifically here. How does freight and the movement of goods happen in this evolving transport system? How do we make that efficient at the same time as making personal movement or personal transport also efficient? Charles, would you like to start there, and maybe Susan next?
So it's a really good question, because at the end of the day, when you talk about a journey, you know, whether it's a private journey or a freight journey, at the highest level, it's still a journey, you see. But obviously there are big differences between freight journeys in Australia. A freight journey in our urban environment has been tremendously affected by COVID. So we don't have freight journeys to our CBD, we have freight journeys to our home. Freight journeys for our regional and remote areas have largely been unaffected, but we have got difficulties at border crossings. We have got difficulties about drivers needing to be tested every 7 days. We have got difficulties about mental health for the drivers. We have got difficulties about where can they go to get a meal as they go from Perth to Darwin and so on, you see. So in a sense, more so for freight, the freight issues, the freight coordination is quite different from the urban environment. So for the urban environment, as I've said before, do we like to see more deliveries to our suburbs and less to our CBDs in the future? And will that change in the next 1 or 2 years? Not only that, can our operational and regulatory frameworks support it, you see? So in addition to the interventions that we might want to make as a community or as governments, right? Then how can we encourage what we feel should be better? And there were other questions about sustainability. Should we encourage more electric vehicles in certain parts of our freight fleet? Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Susan, freight?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think it's a really interesting space. So, traditionally we pretty much think of, separate supply chains for our freight and our people movement. There are some sort of isolated exceptions for that, particularly around air freight, where traditionally we have our freight and our people often on the same planes, but now we're seeing stories of Australia Post having to charter flights because there are no passenger flights for their freight to piggyback on. So there's been some interesting learnings around that space, or interesting twists and turns in that space at the moment. I think at the other end, rather than that line haul end, it's really interesting to start to think about potential for integration of freight and passenger movements at that local level. People don't like seeing freight vehicles in their local landscape, but they're quite used to seeing buses and smaller vehicles moving through. I think we're a little way before we're going to be at that level of integration, but certainly that's an interesting potential to explore around that integration of moving people and moving freight, or in that last mile, and solving that last mile challenge by looking for some efficiencies there, that perhaps the increased level of communication and connectedness and that new sharing of data that can help us to match up those people journeys with those freight journeys, because surely people live in the same places that those parcels need to get to.
So tighter integration.
Definitely an opportunity.
Thanks, Susan. So now I said at the beginning that I wanted to sort of put the COVID turmoil to one side, but the reality is that we can't completely put COVID to one side. COVID's here and we're dealing with it. I would invite you to contemplate how we might best recover from the COVID situation, or what contribution the transport sector might play, and how might the transport sector best accommodate the sort of the COVID situation and the recovery from COVID in the changes that it makes to the way it operates. Perhaps Ishra, starting from a mass perspective at the beginning, and then potentially going on more broadly to vehicle technology and system operations, and Susan and Charles. So recovering from COVID, Ishra.
Thanks, Ian. A very interesting question. I think Charles mentioned it before, every day is different. So I think acknowledging that every day is going to be different, and being as flexible and agile to that change. Different restrictions and the things happening at the border, things are changing every day. And I think that we've done a really great job in adapting to that, but it's how we, particularly as government, set our processes up in the future for that to be part of, I guess, our new normal. For mobility as a service, a few challenges there, particularly around shared trips and people's perception towards social distancing and I guess hygiene in smaller vehicles. But on the flip side of that, you have things like demand responsive transport. So again, it's technology that enables you to book a vehicle, and the operator can actually take into account that social distancing. So you know exactly what you're getting, exactly how many people are in the vehicle, and that's sort of, I guess, in a way taken care of for you. The other flip side is, I guess, we're becoming more local, as Susan mentioned. So, you know, mobility as a service, we might have thought about it as how are we going to use that on our daily commute. If we're working from home, or we're studying from home, or we're doing more and more from home, we are becoming a lot more local. And I think in Queensland, we've seen, as many other states, the increase in active transport, particularly micro-mobility, and people, you know, purchasing scooters. And I myself have seen a lot more of them around the suburbs. So I guess it's about shifting that conversation about first and last mile. The first and last mile might not be as great as it was when we were traveling into the CBD, but people will still have the requirement to move and to connect with their community. So yeah, I think that mass is one of the tools that we have in our toolkit to help us to recover from COVID by giving customers more options to travel and different ways of traveling, but also more information, because what we're finding is people want to know more and more about how safe they're going to be traveling on the network.
Thanks, Ishra. That's fantastic. Susan, recovering from COVID and ITS?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting story. I think there's some really positive stories that I'm hearing coming out of it. Certainly, so I'll step through a few things maybe. I think definitely we want to make people comfortable and safe on public transport. So I know there's a lot of good communication happening about the work that's happening around the cleanliness of vehicles and the opportunity for people to still use public transport if they need to. I think there's also, you know, there's not a lot of research that's coming out and saying people are getting sick on public transport. So, you know, we need to send clear messaging that, you know, there are certain risky behaviours, but maybe being on a bus isn't one of those risky behaviours. People tend to stand and turn away from other people. You're not sitting there having a face-to-face conversation. So there's some, you know, research and information to get out in that space. But we're also seeing that actually, while, you know, people aren't, you know, so keen on sharing vehicles, there has been some positive stories around new mobility as well. So things like the on-demand services, people are now much more comfortable about pre-booking, and the idea that I might let someone know that I need this and that someone knows where I'm going from. And that, whereas in the past, you know, I saw one of our members promoting one of the advantages of their services was that we know where you are and we know who you've been with and we know where you dropped off. Whereas 6 months ago, you would never have promoted that as a positive outcome for one of your journeys. So people becoming, starting to see what was a disadvantage now as a vantage. I think some of the other things just quickly is that we're seeing perhaps a slowdown in the amount that the OEMs are able to spend on the research around automated vehicles. So we're thinking that there's going to be a bit of a pushback in that deployment. But I think that creates an opportunity and an onus on us to step in and look at connected and other safety technologies, and just to look at doing what we do better. There are lots of opportunities to do things better. So it's a chance to take a breath and focus on that.
We're coming close to the end of time. So Charles, just a final word from you on that, on recovering from COVID before we wrap up.
I think the one thing that we know for certain is that life will be different for all of us. What that means, we don't know. Okay. The concepts and the roles and responsibilities that we discussed this morning are still the same. I think Susan mentioned that we are all much more open, and that doesn't just include our own selves, but governments and businesses and so forth. There are huge opportunities for service providers. There are huge opportunities for governments. And right now, I guess we are in a stage, as again Susan mentioned and Ishra as well, where we are collecting a lot of information in terms of changes in freight patterns, changes in commute patterns, and changes even in eating patterns and freight patterns and so forth. Everything is changing. And when you move to a new place, a new home, and then you go to work, there's a period of experimentation. You experiment on different routes, different modes for 3 months, and then you settle in, you see. and then you forget about everything else. You go on autopilot.
I think that's a fantastic note to finish on. We are entering a new place, and we're going to be doing a lot of experimenting and exploring. So I need to close in order to finish in time. So I'd like to thank our three panelists, Charles Carl, Ishra Baksh and Susan Harris. And I particularly want to thank the Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads and their Acting Director of Mobility Policy and Insights, Ted Beek, for their support for the iMOVE project that underpins this webinar. And finally, I thank you, the audience, for your interest in the subject and participating in today's webinar. iMOVE is happy to continue the dialogue with you and invites you to subscribe to our newsletters and news feeds and LinkedIn groups and the likes. And